Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we harvest the fruits of the last week of the journalistic raccolta, the journalistic harvest, as we say in Italian, on the Vatican beat, looking for those few precious fruits that you actually need to have in your possession. Here's where we begin. The shadow of Trump. How the shadow of Donald Trump is hanging over the Vatican's approach to the looming European elections, June 6th through the 9th. We will unpack what's going on and what the Vatican has to say. Second, Israel objects. Once again, the Israeli embassy to the Vatican has lodged a protest about the way the conflict on the Gaza Strip is being characterized in Vatican circles. We'll explain what the latest controversy is and how it illustrates larger tensions. Third, of prayers and protests, how the Pope's brief appearance at a seemingly uncontroversial pro-family event this past week occasioned not only a rare public protest at a papal happening, but also a little bit of hilarity on the part of Pope Francis. We'll unpack all of that. And then finally this week, we've got a tale of two women. How two of the most interesting and influential women on the Vatican scene intersected and collided this week. We'll explain what happened and then try to sort of unpack why both of their stories are so fascinating in the Pope Francis era. All of that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church. So please, for the love of God, in the name of all that is holy, go nowhere, because we will be right back. This is our official Last Week in the Church infomercial, because I come to you with a special offer for all of those would-be Catholic eggheads out there. That is, if you're the kind of person who likes sounding smart, who likes creating the impression that you know things other people don't, that certainly describes me. If that describes you, you're going to want to know about this. Now, I've already spoken about this new app, this new online resource called Magisterium AI. Basically, what it allows you to do is to type in a question like, what does it mean that the Pope is infallible? Or what does the Catholic Church teach about the environment? Or, whatever. And it will give you a short, smart, easily digestible answer based on more than 5,000 official magisterial texts. But recently, these guys have created a new feature on the app. It's called the scholarly mode, which draws not just on official texts, but also the best and brightest of Catholic thinkers and theologians over the centuries, from Augustine and Aquinas to more contemporary figures. And we'll also give you a very quick answer about what those folks have had to say about what the Church teaches on various issues. Now, I promise you that if you try this once, you're going to wonder how in God's name you ever lived without it. It's brought to you by our friends at Longbeard. They are the digital marketing and design company that provide the IT backbone for Crux. They provide the same service for a slew of other Catholic organizations and outfits. They're brilliant, and they are creative, and they are tremendous. And I'm kind of out of adjectives at this point, which is saying something because I traffic in adjectives. But I am telling you, these people are the absolute level best. So check it out. This is Magisterium AI, their new scholarly mode. You're going to dig it. Magisterium.com. That is magisterium.com. It comes with my personal guarantee. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for rejoining us on this episode of Last Week in the Church. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, May 14th. In the year of our Lord 2024. I hope you had a great Feast of Our Lady of Fatima yesterday, because Monday the 13th was, of course, the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima. I mention this because Fatima is undoubtedly, if not the most, certainly among the most famous Marian apparitions of the 20th century. And this Friday, here in Rome, we are scheduled to have a press conference with the current leadership of the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog agency, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, to talk about evaluations of alleged apparitions and other supernatural phenomena. So, in some ways, the Fatima story will be with us again this week. we will, of course, have full coverage. And when I tell you we're going to have full coverage, my promise to you is on Crux, you will have the very best coverage in the Catholic world. And that is because our superstar Vatican correspondent and my wife, Elise Ann Allen, is going to be all over that story. She will have it covered like saran wrap. So be watching the Crux site for the full breakdown of what we get on Friday. All right, we begin this week with the shadow of Donald Trump. Now, the truth of it is, the shadow of Donald Trump hangs over many things in the life of the world in the early 21st century. But one of them is the looming elections for the European Parliament, which are scheduled to take place June 6th through the 9th. So on those days, the 27 member states of the European Union, citizens in those countries, roughly 400 million people, will be electing 720 members of the European Parliament who will chart a course for the European Union over the next 5 years. Voter turnout, we don't know, but it's expected to be somewhere around 50%, one of the highest turnouts in recent cycles of European Parliament elections. And this is because the basic contest in this particular ballot is expected to be between sort of mainstream centrist parties in Europe and the far right. So far right parties in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, and elsewhere. So in other words, it's a contest between a sort of a centrist coalition that wants a strengthened European Union and a far right, I wouldn't call it a coalition because these parties don't agree on very much, but a far right, movement, uprising, insurgency that is skeptical about the European Union and frankly wants a weakened and diminished EU. That is what is at stake in this election. Now, in the context of this looming vote, what we got this past week was a letter from a couple of prominent European clerics addressed to the European Union in the context of the elections that are on the near-term horizon. This letter was signed by Bishop Mariano Crociata, who is a bishop of a diocese here in Italy. He is also the elected president of Comice, which is the sort of umbrella group of bishops' conferences of the European Union. So he would be the logical figure to sign a letter regarding the upcoming European elections. However, Crociata was not the most interesting signatory to this letter. The guy who was actually far more interesting was Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Bologna, who is the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, but perhaps more importantly, is Pope Francis's designated factotum, his diplomatic troubleshooter, in particular on the conflict in Ukraine, but he is kind of understood to be Pope Francis's guy on a wide variety of European and international questions. Now, in many ways, it is a bit odd that Zuppi would sign this letter because typically this message ahead of European elections comes from Comice, this body that brings together the bishops' conferences of the European Union. Zuppi has no office in Comice whatsoever. He has no authority to speak on behalf of European bishops. But the fact that it was desired, and obviously I'm using the passive voice here, it was desired. I'm not saying by whom, okay? But the fact that somebody, probably in Rome, probably who lives in a building that has a cupola on top of it, somebody in Rome wanted Zuppi's signature on this letter indicates to you that there was a desire to make it clear that this is not simply the opinion of a random bishop from some mid-sized Italian diocese, but this letter reflects the thinking of the Catholic hierarchy in the Vatican sort of toot court, okay? And the content of the letter, I mean, in one way, it's not surprising. Zuppi and Crociata talk about the importance of the EU defending migrants and being against war and so on. But what is most interesting in this context is that they also call for a strengthened and enhanced European Union. They call for a more assertive foreign policy on the part of the EU. They also call, and this is really interesting, they call for a common defense strategy on the part of the EU. Now, think about what a common defense strategy on the part of the EU would mean. It would mean more expenditures on armaments, which is exactly the contrary of what Pope Francis and his guys typically call for. But in this case, they are actually urging Europe to ramp up not only its foreign policy independence, but also its defense independence. They further call upon the EU to embrace enlargement, that is, the addition of further member states, all of which is part of the centrist European agenda to make the EU a stronger, more assertive, and more independent actor in global affairs. Now, why is the Vatican calling for this right now? Well, in part because they have a long-standing commitment to European unity, but in part because many analysts believe that if the centrists are going to hold the far right at bay, that is, this populist, nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-EU force that Pope Francis abhors, that he considers the bête noire of 21st century politics, if centrists in the EU are going to hold that at bay, what is their best calling card? The best calling card is the prospect of a new Trump papacy in the United States. Because what polls across the European Union show is that left, right, and center, most Europeans don't want Donald Trump back as president of the United States. Most of them feel that a new Trump papacy would mean a diminished United States commitment to Europe, and it would also mean foreign policy divergences between the United States and Europe. In other words, the Vatican, in this letter from Zuppi and Crociati, indirectly is attempting to play what many analysts believe is perhaps the only winning card that centrist pro-European forces in these elections have, which is to argue that if you want to deconstruct the European Union right now, if you want to cut it down to size, if you want to dial back your commitment, what is the alternative? The alternative is Donald Trump in the United States. And the betting is that most European voters, if they have to choose between a strengthened EU, which may not be their wildest fantasy, but if they have to choose between that and a triumphant comeback of Trump in the United States, they're going to choose the strengthened EU. That appears to be the overall centrist strategy, and it appears the Vatican is willing to back that in the kind of indirect and implied fashion in which the Vatican engages most political issues. All right, we come second this week to Israel Objects. So, this past week, the Vatican staged another edition of what has become a kind of annual hootenanny entitled the World Meeting on Human Fraternity. And it is sponsored by a Vatican foundation called the Fratelli Tutti Foundation, named for the 2020 encyclical letter by Pope Francis dedicated to the theme of human fraternity called Fratelli Tutti. This foundation is led by Italian Cardinal Mauro Gambetti, who was also the archpriest of St. Peter's Basilica. And typically it brings together a kind of cross-section of Nobel Peace Prize winners who come together in the Vatican to, promote good causes. Peace, justice, mom, apple pie, things that most people of goodwill would support and believe in. So, this edition took place this past week. One of the participants was a 2011 Nobel Peace Prize winner from Yemen by the name of Tawakkul Kamaran, a woman who was the first Arab woman ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She got the award in 2011. She's a journalist for her coverage of the Arab Spring uprisings, and she is considered one of the most prominent pro-democracy, pro-human rights voices across the Arab world. And she was invited to be one of the roughly 30 Nobel Peace Prize winners who took part in this Vatican meeting. So, she, on Friday night, was given the opportunity to give a brief address to the assembly, where not only Gambetti was present, but also Rome Mayor Roberto Gualtieri, And during her brief address, she had sent out tweets. Well, I'm sorry, it's no longer Twitter, is it? The social media platform now known as X, formerly known as Twitter. She had put out before her speech and afterwards, sort of a capsule version of what she was going to say. And basically, Cameron used this opportunity to describe what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip as genocide and ethnic cleansing, and to express solidarity for anti-Israel student protests across across the world, and you know, to basically say the international community stop should do everything it can to stop Israel's military actions in Gaza. In response to that, late Saturday evening, the Israeli embassy to the Holy See issued a communique in which it objected in very strong terms, said it was experiencing indignation and shock about the comments that had been made at this Vatican gathering, insisted that to say that Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing in Gaza when every day the Israeli forces permit large quantities of humanitarian aid to arrive in the Gaza Strip is, according to the Israeli statement, Orwellian. And further, the Israelis said there was a moral duty for someone in the Vatican to stand up and stop this, what they called propaganda speech full of lies, and also added that what all this indicates is that anti Semitism and prejudice against Jews is still very much alive. Now, what are we to make of all of this? Well, on the one hand, it illustrates the difficulty the Vatican has whenever it stages an event when they invite people who are not under the Vatican's direct control. I mean, if you're going to invite distinguished global movers and shakers to a Vatican event on the grounds that you want to hear what they have to say, you can't in advance tell them what they can and cannot say, right? So it's a problem. But on the other hand, you also have to take responsibility for what is said in a Vatican venue. And, how to strike that balance appropriately is always difficult. It should be said, and this is hardly the first time since the outbreak of the conflict between Israel and Hamas on Gaza, that Israelis have been upset. They were upset in November when Pope Francis met with a group of Palestinians from Gaza who claimed that he had used the word genocide to describe what was going on. The Vatican tried to deny that, but in a kind of weak and indirect fashion. Many Israelis and Jews were upset again in January when there was an event at the Gregorian University in which some speakers used language regarding Israel and the Gaza Strip that was considered offensive. They were upset again in February when Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Pope's Secretary of State, described Israel's response in Gaza as disproportionate and also cited casualty figures from the Gaza Health Ministry that Israel disputes. All of this would suggest that there is a persistent pattern here in which the Vatican is trying to find ways to illustrate its concern for the humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Gaza without fundamentally blowing up its relationship with Israel and with global Judaism. And what this past week would suggest is that that effort to thread that needle is still very much a work in progress. All right, third up this week, we've got of prayers and protests. So this week, there was an event that took place here in Rome called the General State of the Birth Rate. And this is an annual event in which pro-family groups in Italy come together to, well, basically what? Grouse about Italy's historically low fertility rate. The most recent numbers from the Italian government are this past year, Italy set another historic low in terms of live births. There were 379,000 live births in Italy last year. The estimate is that for Italy to maintain a healthy ratio between elderly and young, it would need about 500,000 live births every year. So it's obviously pretty far behind. Okay? And so this meeting is an annual event where people who are concerned about demographics and about the state of the family in Italy come together to try to promote policies that would encourage young Italians to have children. By the way, most polls in Italy show that young Italian couples would like to have 2 or 3 or 4 children, but they feel that finances and social reality are against them. They feel they can't do that because of financial and social constraints. So this event is an attempt to sort of break through all that and figure out policies that would look different. This year, Pope Francis agreed to make the brief trip, because this event, by the way, was held in an auditorium at the end of the Via della Conciliazione. That's the broad street that leads up to St. Peter's Basilica, right? And so Pope Francis agreed to hop in his Ford Fiat and take the very brief, like it's 30 seconds really, down the Via della Conciliazione and then hop out of the car and go in and give a little fervorino, a little talk to this group. And in his talk, he called for family-friendly policies. He said that, mothers should not be asked to choose between going to work and taking care of their children. Young couples should not have to choose between having a child and being able to buy a house, that kind of thing. He also said that it is indicative of the temper of the times that two of the most profitable enterprises these days are making contraceptives and making weapons, both of which are anti-life and anti-family. And, so in other words, he went to deliver a basically pro-family message. Now, two things made this noteworthy. One, there were protests. There were young people who were actually beaten by police as they were trying to march on the site of where the Pope is speaking. However, they were not upset at the Pope specifically. They were upset at a minister of the Italian government who was speaking at this event, who they considered responsible for allowing pro-life groups to be present at family planning clinics where Italian women who are seeking an abortion have to go to get a certificate. So this wasn't exactly a complaint about the Pope, although it should be said that many Italian leftists are upset that this Pope appears to support the pro-family agenda of the current center-right government of Italy under Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. So this wasn't exactly a protest against the Pope, but it was at least a protest where the Pope was going to be. Okay? Now, the other thing that is interesting is that while the Pope was giving his little talk, he also managed to deliver a kind of memorable laugh line. I mean, this was kind of the Pope's evening at the Improv, because at the end of his little talk, he issued his standard invitation for people to pray for him, and he added what is kind of his standard soundbite when he says, and by the way, when you pray for me, not against me. Okay, now he says that all the time at public appearances, but on this occasion, he kind of launched into a stream of consciousness thing where he said, oh, and by the way, some time ago, I was having an audience at the Vatican. There was this old lady I saw there who asked me to come over. So I went over to talk to her. She was, this cool woman, and she told me she was 87 years old, coincidentally, exactly the Pope's age today. And Francis said, he asked the woman what was her secret for staying so young. She said she ate ravioli every day, ravioli that she made herself. Francis said she gave him the recipe. But then, he said, he asked her to pray for him. And she said she did every day. And he said, by the way, please pray for me, not against me. And he quoted her response as being, pay attention, Holy Father, because the people praying against you were over there. Okay, pointing to the Vatican. Okay? And then the Pope laughed and said, she's clever. Huh? Clever. He used the Italian word furba, which means clever. And then said, yeah, maybe she's a little anti-clerical, but, the implication was she probably had a point. That there are probably some people in the Vatican who aren't entirely thrilled with the Pope Francis agenda. So, at the same occasion, the very same event, the Pope experienced both heartburn, that is, people protesting his apparent endorsement of a somewhat conservative agenda that some progressive young Italians don't like, but at the same time, also hilarity in the sense that he was able to deliver a kind of punchline that played very well in the Italian media. All right, finally this week, we've got a tale of two women. So there are two prominent women on the Vatican scene whose storylines intersected this week. One is an Italian laywoman named Barbara Yatta, who is the director of the Vatican Museums. She is the first female director of the Vatican Museum. She was appointed to that position in 2017. She is considered illustrative of the effort to empower women during the Pope Francis era, because the Vatican Museum is a big deal. It employs about 700 people. It has annual revenues that are, they don't actually reveal these numbers, but they're estimated somewhere around 100 million euro. It's probably the single most important profit center for the Vatican city state. And so the fact that a woman is running all of that is considered a big deal. Yada, by the way, comes from an extraordinarily distinguished Italian family. They come from southern Italy, the region of Puglia. They were nobility, old Italian nobility. In the 19th century, her family amassed what was considered probably the most impressive private archaeological collection in the entire country, which they bequeathed to the Italian government. It's become the Palazzo Yatta, the Yatta Palace, has become a national museum in Puglia, and it's located in the family's ancestral estate. So, in a way, art and culture is in her blood. She worked for 15 years as part of the National Graphic Arts Institute in Italy, then became an employee of the Vatican Library, and in 2017 took over the Vatican Museums. So, this week, two different things occurred on her watch, both of which have caused her no small degree of agita. One is that a group of local residents are complaining that too many tourists are showing up at early hours outside the entrance to the Vatican museums. They claim it begins at like around 5 o'clock in the morning. And they start shouting and singing and kind of making a ruckus, which makes it impossible for people who live in that neighborhood to have a good night's sleep. They have appealed both to the Italian police and to Yatta to do something about it, so far to no avail. This would be a kind of victim of your own success story, right? There are so many people who want to get into the Vatican museums that keeping them quiet, even at odd hours, is a problem. So that's one thing Yatta has to deal with. Now, the other is that a group of 49 employees of the Vatican Museum have sent a complaint to the cardinal who runs the Vatican city state, threatening a class action lawsuit to which Yatta would be a party because she's the director of the Vatican Museums, lodging all sorts of labor complaints. Like, they claim that there's problems with their overtime pay, there are problems with working conditions, various other things at the Vatican Museums that they're objecting to. And, they're asking Yatta, as the director of the Vatican Museums, to take responsibility for all of this. Now, so she is facing these pressures as director of one of the Vatican's most important and most profitable institutions. Now, who is the lawyer representing these 49 Italian employees of the Vatican Museums who are claiming labor abuses? The lawyer is another Italian laywoman by the name of Laura Segro. And if that name seems familiar, it should, because Segro has become, well, basically the omnibus lawyer for anybody who is mad at the Vatican about absolutely anything. Segro represents the mother of Cedric Tourné, the victim in the infamous Swiss Guard murder in the Vatican from the early 2000s. She represented Francesca Cialqui, the femme fatale, at the heart of the second VatiLeaks scandals in 2014-2015. She represents the Orlandi family, the family of the Vatican girl, the famous unresolved mystery of the teenage girl who went missing in 1983, whose father was a Vatican employee, which has become one of the great Vatican mysteries of all time. She represents several of the victims of Father Marko Rupnik, the famed Slovenian artist and muralist, whose alleged sexual abuse of nuns is probably the most pernicious and debated contemporary case of sexual abuse in the Vatican and the contemporary Catholic Church. And now she represents these Vatican employees, these Vatican Museum employees who want to file a lawsuit. I mean, basically speaking, if you have a bone to pick with the Vatican, Laura Segro, who is a native of Sicily, who has degrees both in civil and canon law, she has become your go-to resource. And now, the most interesting aspect of this Vatican Museums case is that it may create a head-to-head conflict between the woman who represents the commitment to empower women on the Pope Francis watch, Barbara Gatta, director of the Vatican Museums, and the woman who represents arguably the greatest threat to the Vatican papacy, another empowered woman in the Pope Francis era, Laura Segura. Watching these two duke it out, ladies and gentlemen, this could be the must-see TV of the Vatican in 2024. We will, of course, track this story on the Crux site. All right, that is our show for this week. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel as ever. In the meantime, over the course of the next 7 days, my invitation to you is to have a fantastic and blessed week. Stay safe, stay healthy. We will talk to you again very soon. In the meantime, keep reading Crux. In particular, have your eyes on Crux on Friday from my wife and our superstar Vatican correspondent's breaking coverage of whatever the Vatican has to say about apparitions in the Pope Francis era. We'll talk to you again very soon.